Hey everyone, and welcome to episode 5 of Tennis Uncovered. I'm so excited to be releasing this episode because it's a special one. My brother Tim Hyman joins the pod for the very first time. Now Tim is studying to be a Juris Doctor at Sydney Uni's Law School, and of course he's come on to discuss the Jannik Sinner doping case. This week, Jannik Sinner accepted a 3-month ban from tennis. He'll return in time for the next Grand Slam of the year at the French Open, but most importantly, he'll return 3 days before his home Masters 1000 event in Rome. Now, while Tim doesn't pretend to know all the specific ins and outs of the Jannik Sinner doping case, he offers a fascinating perspective from someone studying law at this very moment in time, and I think it's something that a lot of the listeners will really enjoy hearing about. Tim has a degree of international relations and philosophy from the University of St Andrews. I'm pretty sure it's safe to say he's the brainy brother of the Hyman family, so very, very glad he can come on to talk about this really interesting case. Now, Tim states interest in studying sports law, but his main objective is coming out of the degree and going into commercial law, but nonetheless, he offers amazing insights, and I think you'll really, really enjoy it. If you're all set, let's get into the chat with Tim Hyman. Well, I'm very excited to have Tim Hyman, you might recognise the surname, onto the Tennis Uncovered podcast. Tim, how are you doing?
I'm very well. I'm very, very well. Very, very happy to be here. I've been looking forward to this for a little while. It's taken a little while to set it up, but we're finally here.
Yeah, we're here. Just quickly, for those listening and that don't know us so well, you're studying law and you're getting towards the end of your studies now in Sydney. Can you just briefly explain the course you're on?
Yes. So I am doing a Juris Doctor, which is a postgraduate law degree in Australia. I'm doing it at the University of Sydney. It takes 3 years. You do it after having done an undergraduate degree. And then hopefully at the end of it, you become admitted as a solicitor. I'm in New South Wales, so that's where that would be for me. I'm 2 years through, 1 year to go. I'm looking to go into commercial law myself, but I just at the end of last year did an elective in sports law, which is what I think makes me the candidate for this particular episode of Tennis Uncovered.
Yeah, out of all the lawyers I could have chosen, I've chosen Tim because he's studying a very relevant topic at the moment. And obviously you did that really interesting essay last term. Can you just briefly describe that? And you got a pretty good mark as well. So I think that makes you a very credible source. So sorry if I put you on the spot. But it was all about just sort of summing up the case of Sinner, and to note it was before a lot of the recent stuff has happened because it was before Christmas. So all we knew was that the ITIA had provisionally banned Sinner, but he had then revoked that appeal to ban him, and so he continued playing. But just a brief summary of that, and we'll go into it a bit more later.
Yeah, that's right. So I was writing this in around, gosh, you can probably correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it would have been around November time. And I cannot remember the date when it was decided that he was awarded no fault or negligence, and that he was sort of acquitted of all penalty. I started writing before that point, and already looking at the facts and what the law was, I was sort of thinking, I'm not sure that that's quite right. And then that result came through as I was writing. No, that's not actually quite right. That result had come through. I knew it was no fault or negligence, that was the decision. And I was thinking that's not quite right. I'm not sure that they can decide that there's been absolutely zero fault, which is pretty much what the standard is at law. So I was skeptical of that, and then whether, as I was writing, said we're going to appeal this. So that was quite interesting for me because I thought, well, we'll see whether what I'm writing about the law and how it's applied is correct, because ultimately a tribunal, not a tribunal, CAS, the Court of Arbitration for Sport, which I think we'll probably talk about, will ultimately have to come to a decision, and they'll have to give reasons for their answers. So I'll either be proven right or wrong as to whether my application of the law is correct. Unfortunately, that actually hasn't happened because, as again, I think we'll probably discuss a little bit in further detail, they've come to this amazing settlement, which means that we won't know how CAS applies these particular quite unusual facts to the law, which is a shame for me, because I won't know whether what I've written is actually is what they would have come to conclusion wise at CAS. So sorry, to answer your actual question, which is what the paper was about. It was really just a discussion of the case. Yeah, it was that. It was really essentially just that. With this, I mean, I did a big explanation of what the law was and how I thought it should be applied. But then I think the second half of my paper basically was trying to talk about whether the process or that someone who is that has a doping scandal, the way that the ITIA and the way that CAS deals with that is unfair and sort of biased towards those players who have a higher level of resources to work with. So ultimately, I concluded that that like many systems in this world, they are biased towards the people with more money, and I think I'll leave it at that as a high level sort of conclusion, and we can get into the detail in a bit. But that's sort of what it was about. Yeah.
It is. Now I think about it, it is a bit of a shame that the CAS sort of appeal didn't go all the way through, because you really would have seen, you really would have been able to criticize or actually think about your essay in a way of, oh, I was pretty spot on there, or maybe I got that bit wrong and that's why. So that would have been quite nice for you. So that's a bit of a shame, but yeah. Oh, well.
It is a shame. It is a shame, because I was really, at the time that I was writing, there was no reason for it to be appealed other than, I mean, I thought it should have been, and then it was, and I thought, oh, that's fantastic, because then they'll basically be marking my essay and I was sort of tempted to maybe put it up on LinkedIn or sort of chuck it out and see what the sort of commentators or legal experts in this area thought of it as a sort of what I thought the conclusion of it should be. I actually didn't give a sort of a penalty, a guess of a penalty in months, for example, even though in my own mind I thought he would end up getting 6 months. That's not, so I didn't sort of put that as it would have been a pretty arbitrary guess, but that was my guess. I think it was around 6 months. So I was pretty surprised when he ended up with 3. But yeah, we'll never know how CAS sort of would have worked through the specifics of the law. But I think ultimately as well, I'm not sure how much the tennis community actually cares about the specifics of the law. I think, and that's sort of something interesting we can talk about as well, is that everyone sees what's happened and then they see the result, and there's not all that much analysis about, well, why have they come to that result, and what are the specifics, because it gets quite detailed, and understandably people don't probably really care about the details. They care like, oh, well, this is what we think he did. He had this massage and, his physio shouldn't have been using that cream or should have been aware of it or whatever it was. And this is also unfair. But if you actually look at the law, you get a bit of a different understanding. But yeah.
Yeah, no, it is very interesting. And I guess, I mean, a lot of the listeners, the few that are listening, but I'm sure it'll be much more after this one, they'll know the case, they'll know the basics of what happened. They would have probably listened to and read a fair bit because it is very much a tennis audience. But I do want to just single out what's happened this week and the settlement that they've reached. But just to explain, so Jannik Sinner accepted an immediate 3-month ban this week from tennis after he reached a settlement with the World Anti-Doping Agency over his 2 positive drugs tests last year. So this means that he'll come back ready to play the next Grand Slam, which is the French Open, and he'll also be eligible to play his home Masters 1000 event in Rome. So just
a little bit of context. Obviously, Sinner tested positive for clostebol. It's a banned substance on WADA's list. It wasn't made public at the time that he tested positive because he was able to provide an explanation for it being in his body. People can argue whether that's because he had very good lawyers. Personally, I think it's because he knew where it came from, and there was a plausible cause for that. Not a plausible cause, but a plausible reason for that. However, the ITIA continued to examine that because it was just a sort of to buy him time situation. They still continued to examine it. They then ruled through the independent tribunal that he bared no fault or negligence and he should carry on playing tennis. But then WADA, the World Anti-Doping Agency, appealed to CAS, the Court of Arbitration for Sport, as you've already pointed out, Tim, that they saw fit to probably ban him up to 2 years. But this week, the announcement was made that WADA actually said, you know what, fair enough. We don't think Sinner intended to cheat. It didn't provide him any performance enhancement, and it really happened without him knowing it was happening. He didn't ask for his physio to have that cream on his hand. So therefore, the appeal no longer goes to CAS, and they've reached this settlement. So that's just sort of a little bit of a timeline. That's what happened this week. We can pretty much call quits on this case now. He will return just before the Rome Masters. I think it's 3 days, and he'll play. And we'll get into all the little bits that's happened as a result of that. But I just want to ask you, like, do you think that is the right outcome? I know that's a tough question, but just your opinion from what you've learned.
Yeah, I think it's as I said before, like I did have a prediction. I thought he would get 6 months. And I'm pretty sure, yeah, I wrote it a little while ago, so it's a bit hazy, but I'm pretty sure that sort of WADA, when they appealed, they sort of appealed saying, we expect that this appeal will lead to a ban of between 1 and 2 years. That's sort of what they were aiming to get out of making that appeal. And I was thinking, well, whether the law basically says that there is this like 0 to 2 year span of if there is not no fault or negligence, but some fault or negligence. I can't remember what the sort of technical term is. Then according to the level of fault, you get between 0 and 2 years. And I thought that for the level of fault that Sinner and his team were at, it would probably come to about 6 months. 3 and 6 months, it's probably not that much. But actually, thinking about it now, what you've just described is that he'll come back after 3 months and he'll still be able to play the French. He'll be able to play Wimbledon. 6 months wouldn't have allowed him to do that. There's a lot happens in tennis in 6 months that actually doesn't happen in 3. So I think that actually is quite a significant difference. Probably there are people out there who would think he should have got what WADA was aiming for, which is between 1 year and 2 years. And that would have really significant, being out for 1 to 2 years is, half a lifetime for a tennis player, I suspect. Careers are not massive. So yeah, do I think the right thing happened? I'm not sure I do, actually. I think tennis is one of the most, it's known to be elite. It's known to be sort of a game of kings. Like I think it's supposed to be, it's a very unequal sport, especially at the top level. And I think this sort of thing, it just confirms that, and it confirms that it's a sport for people with money, and it protects the people in the game with money. Having said that, there is another side to it, which is that ultimately I partially agree with what you said, which is that the reason that he's got such a small penalty is because he knew where the substance came from, and ultimately there wasn't that much fault. So arguably 3 months was appropriate. I think ultimately would have just come down to a matter of the judgment of the people on the panel, the arbitration panel in CAS, if it went to that. And they may well have, those people on the day may well have thought, oh, well, actually the level of fault we judge it to be 6 months or a year, in comparison to other cases. Sharapova's case. I think Cilic, there was a case, a doping case about him that was that came to the forefront of the media at that time in like '08 or something. They might have decided that in comparison to those, it was a bit more than 3 months. Who knows? I think ultimately it should have been between 6 months to a year, and that would have been significantly more disruptive to Sinner's career than 3 months. I think they've been a bit sort of what's the word, blind to the sort of the sense of the tennis community, as a better turn of phrase than that, but in the sense that what does this look like? It looks like they've basically just sort of worked out a little deal where he can not miss any Grand Slams, and they're a bit sort of sense blind if they're thinking that they were going to make this decision with no controversy. I think they needed to sort of maybe come to a different conclusion. But yeah, sorry, that was a big ramble and not much of a clarity of conclusion, but there were some thoughts there.
Yeah, that's something that I did want to pick up on, because actually you mentioned there that the difference between 3 months and 6 months initially doesn't seem like crazy amounts, but in the tennis calendar, it means a heck of a lot, especially in this time of the year, because say it was a 6 month ban, he then, you're right, misses the French, he then misses Wimbledon because they're so close together. And potentially, does he miss the US as well? I mean, he wouldn't be far off anyway. He wouldn't be having much of a warm-up sort of tournament phase if he was banned for 6 months, and then he played the US Open. So that is quite interesting for people to know, I think, that actually this 3 month really does work in Sinner's favour a hell of a lot. And so you can possibly understand some of the frustrations of other players on tour. But I do just want to ask you, I mentioned in that sort of little summary that WADA appealed to the Court of Arbitration for Sport for against the ITIA's original statement or non-ban, I guess. Why are they? It seems like they're working against each other. Can you just explain a little bit why WADA would try and go against what ITIA say?
So WADA is, as far as I understand, their role is to sort of uphold doping standards across all sports, and that's something that I wasn't aware of before studying this. Is that this isn't just a tennis sort of subject. WADA is the World Anti-Doping Agency. There is one set of rules, the World Anti-Doping Code, and that applies across all sports. There are minor differences in terms of specific substances, I believe, but there is one code that applies across all sports. The ITIA is a tennis-specific agency, obviously, that enforces ethics in tennis, and doping is a part of that. So ultimately, the ITIA is a smaller organization. It's just tennis-specific. In the first instance, the ITIA will make a decision, and if the World Anti-Doping Agency believes that decision does not live up to the standards that the World Anti-Doping Code sort of is trying to reach, then they, through, I imagine, a contractual relationship between the tennis player and either the ATP or whatever professional body that they have that relationship with, WADA will be able to appeal through a clause in that contract. So that's how I understand it. I see what you mean, that they sort of seem to be working against. I think WADA's just ultimately, they're a regulatory body. They're trying to maintain standards. As is the ITIA. I don't think they're necessarily working against each other. It's just that it's in the same way that you can sort of think about it like different levels of courts. Like you've got your a local court, and then a district court, and then the Supreme Court, or the highest court in the land. It's not an appeal to a higher court. Is not that different court levels are sort of against each other. It's just that a higher court, they basically they're a higher authority. They'll have sort of more experienced judges who will know the law better. And one of the parties, in this case, it's WADA, is applying to CAS, which is sort of the highest court in the sporting land, a decision that sort of a lower authority, the ITIA, has made. So it's just sort of a different version of the court system, but in in sporting land, if you will, because there is no, it's sort of not really its own jurisdiction. It's sort of international, isn't it? And it's sort of, I don't know, I can feel myself leading on to a conversation about the difference between criminal law, which is what I think a lot of people think that this area of law actually is, because there seems to be punishments and there seems to be sort of a lot of the language used seems to be similar to criminal law, and it's not. It's contract law. It's just basically regulating relationships between the players and governing bodies of the sports. So interesting difference that I think a lot of people misunderstand.
I'm pretty sure that is let's move on to that, because that is a really interesting topic. And yeah, I'm one of those people that immediately thinks, oh, like Sinner's done something really, really bad here. And like, he's not going to go to, it's not one of those cases where he's going to go to prison because taking a billionth of a gram bit of clostebol is not illegal. But it is illegal in the sense that you've signed into a contract that says you won't be doing that, or you won't be taking a list of these substances, and he did. So yeah, that is sort of something that you don't really know, if you're not sort of in the law world, you don't really understand. So where do you think that has sort of troubled the public? Do you think that they have a misunderstanding and that's contributed to their sort of idea of Sinner really being in the wrong? I mean, okay, yes, he's in the wrong, but in terms of his reputation, do you think that has played its part in the public view of him?
Yeah, I think it has, and I'm not sure whether it should have done.
Yeah,
I think that there is confusion between what the public think is. It would be very easy for a member of the public to think if there's a penalty, then this is sort of similar to like committing a crime. It's nothing to do with. There's a lot of these substances that are banned by sports and tennis. They're not criminally banned substances. Like you and I could go. We're not professional sports people. You and I could take them, and there would be. I know some of them might be criminally banned, but I think a lot of them aren't. I'm pretty sure clostebol. It's not criminally banned substance. You can get it over the counter in Italy. We definitely know that out of this whole experience. So it's nothing to do with the criminal law. It's just that when you as a professional tennis player sign up to the ATP, that is a contractual. You're sort of promising, I will play on this tour and I'll reap the benefits from playing on this tour, and in return, I promise not to use these substances when I play in these sorts of tournaments. It's just two parties making promises about their relationship and what each of those parties is getting out of that relationship. And it's the rules that govern that relationship. So yeah, there really shouldn't be, there is an ethical side, obviously, because there's reputations, there's money at stake, there's, tournaments and winning tournaments at stake. And, if one person gets to win a tournament at the expense of others, using foul play such as doping, there's an ethical side to that. But yeah, it shouldn't be confused with criminal law. And I think, probably members of the public might have difficulty with that. And I think, he's not, what has he done wrong? I think the only thing that he's really done wrong, if anything, is to not have sort of owned up to the fact that it's the rules are that a member of your team, you are responsible for anything that a member of your team does. Ultimately, a member of his team, although albeit supposedly unknowingly applied this substance to him, it was still a member of his team that applied the substance to him. So I think that's where a lot of the confusion has happened with the decision and the decision of no fault or negligence. It was all around that, and there was, I think, that was a misapplied aspect of that part of the law. But in terms of, do I think he should be seen as sort of ethically lower than other players? No, I don't think so. And I think everyone knows this in the tennis world, that he's sort of one of the most law-abiding guys out there. And I think that's been said quite a lot. And I think that's obviously it was true if it's going to be said by lots of the people who know him well and who play alongside him and against him. And I think you have to take that at face value, don't you? That's essentially.
just sort of touching on that, yes, more specific law side of things again, that idea of contract law and criminal law. Okay, to Sinner's lawyer, Jamie Singer, I believe it is, sort of approaching the case when he was asked to take on the case for Sinner and defend him. How do you think initially he approaches that? What's his go-to? Is there something that comes to his mind saying, right, this is how we're going to prove his innocence? Is there something that, you know, as someone studying law that you generally go to in terms of, right, this is how we're going to prove his innocence? Is there something that stands out to you in Sinner's sort of side of the case, or his his story that is like, right, this is how we're going to prove his innocence?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question, and it goes to the early days of Sinner and his team getting the notice to say, you have tested positive for clostebol, and then immediately the lawyers would have been contacted, and they know they know the rules on this inside out, and they know that you have to find within a certain period, I think, is it 48 hours or something like that, if you can identify the source and provide evidence for your story of the source of that, then as we've seen, because it's what happened to Sinner, you are able to continue playing. I think he had a few days off there. I think the ban is sort of with immediate effect, and then within 48 hours, if you can identify the source, then they give you the benefit of the doubt until,
and then it also doesn't go into the public eye as well, which I think was a big thing for him, and that people felt a little bit not transparent.
Yeah, I know. I didn't understand the whole not in the public eye thing. I mean, yeah, maybe there was. I can sort of see why people were upset about that. But ultimately,
but it was within the rules.
It is within the rules. Yeah, I think this is what people misunderstand. Is it's what those are the rules that they sign up to. I ultimately think it was probably just decided wrongly initially. Well, clearly it was, because it was appealed and then there was a different conclusion. But yeah, back to what you were asking, in terms of, I think in terms of like what a lawyer is thinking, what do we need to do? Well, they know we need to identify the source. That's what they did. And it goes to your point of, well, partially that might be up to Jamie Singer's, genius tactics as a lawyer, or maybe they just were able to find the source because they were able to find the source, and they thought, well, okay, damn, we test positive. This is incredibly serious. Let's all think incredibly hard about what the source of this could be, because we've been advised by our lawyer that is the way out of this. We need to find something. We need to find something. Well, maybe that's what they were thinking, but we need to find the genuine source to this. And to be fair, if I think about it now, how hard would that have been? They would have thought, what have I eaten? That's the big one. I mean, loads of players get done for eating meat that has substances in it. I think from South America that they use, and that is banned by the WADA code. But they'll also have been thinking, how else can, that's probably another part where, smart lawyers who are well prepared can say, these are the sorts of things you need to think about. What have you eaten? What has someone applied to your skin? They'll have had really good advice as to, like, you need to identify the source, and these are the sorts of things that you need to think about. What you've done in the last, week or whatever it is, the last few weeks. And they would have gone through everything that he's eaten, everything that he's applied to his body. They would have found that the physio used this thing, and there it would have been. I can see why the tribunal has said, right, well, it's a fairly believable story. It's interesting. I was actually listening to another podcast on this. I believe you said you knew these guys, and I can't remember the name of their podcast. It was a little snippet.
The tennis podcast weekly, the weekly tennis podcast.
There you go. I couldn't remember what their name was, but thank you to those guys for an interesting little snippet on this. And they were, having said that, I'm not sure I agreed with what they were saying on this. They were saying, oh, well, this is sort of the blueprint. We've been given the blueprint for how to get away with doping. And I was like, well, that really only applies if in fact you have had a massage with a substance that has clostebol in it, because that's the reason they were able to identify the source, is because the source was very innocent. It happened to be this thing. It's incredibly unlikely that it was performance enhancing, and it's a sort of a plausible story. I think, yeah. So I don't think that leads to a conclusion of, well, now we know how to get away with doping, because this is an incredibly unusual case. What I do think is the sketchiest sort of side of this is, well, why were they able to identify so quickly what the source was? And why hadn't they done that already? And why hadn't they been careful, especially when lots of Italian, and not just tennis players, I think there was a basketball player who had been done for doping for exactly this substance from exactly this sort of thing a couple of years before. And I think there was some scandal about Nardi, the guy Nardi, who was his physio, had worked with that basketball team and so should have been aware of the risks of that sort of contamination. Those are the sorts of questions that I would be asking about this decision is, and this is where I think the fairness of, how much money Sinner has and the resources they have at their disposal, should those guys be held to a standard where, if you're at the absolute top of your game, should there be a higher standard of, there's an absolutely zero excuse with all the resources you have, and they've earned the resources. He's a bloody good tennis player and he's done incredibly well. But given that, you have the money to be able to be completely clean and vet every single substance that comes in contact with your body and that you eat. And I think there are situations that can be exceptions to that, but I'm not sure this is one of them. I think this is obviously something where, there's a question. Should they have known that they were using something that, albeit a very small substance, that had something that was banned? Some people will say, no, the same standards should be held for all players. But I think there is a question over the Sinners. He will have a team of 5 or 6 that you probably know how big Sinner's team is, and I don't, but there's a massive team around him. There are people paid big money to be able to solve these sorts of problems, and they didn't do it. So even though he is one of the best players on the tour in terms of doing things by the book, clearly lots of other players managed to do it and avoid taking this stuff, and he on this occasion didn't. And we can ask the question, is that because he wasn't careful enough? There is a question there, I think, that's worth asking. Sorry, that was a very long ramble.
Maybe that would counter the fact that the sort of inequalities in tennis where the top players, top probably 50, I probably wouldn't even go as far as to say top 100, because those lower end players probably wouldn't even have that much money. But yeah, top 50, especially top 10, they've got enough money to pay for this really impressive team behind them when it comes to sort of trying to back them up. In terms of the law, maybe having that rule where, because you have that much support around you in terms of your physical team with you day in day out on the court, but also the legal team, then you should be held to that standard of, you have there should be no chance that you're making these mistakes by having a massage with this cream in with the banned substance. Maybe that could counteract the fact that inequality of, right, well, the 117th ranked player, actually they don't have the support around this, so it's probably more likely that's going to happen. For the top guys, it really shouldn't happen. So
I think that's a good point. Absolutely right, and it sort of reminds me that maybe the law and sport needs to catch up with the law that happens, the commercial law that happens elsewhere. In other areas of the law, discretion is used much more widely. I think that a lot of people think the law is black and white, but when it gets to sort of these big cases, judges have, in some cases, quite a high level of discretion that they can use and they can take into account. Or things like, in terms of the liability of a very large company, there are certain, if you're working out what the liability of a very large company is in particular legal issues, then sometimes they can take into account, well, this is a massive global corporation. They should have known XYZ. They had the resources to protect themselves against XYZ liability or XYZ risk. Definitely judges take that into account, and I think sport can maybe learn from that. Should they take into account that Sinner has 10 100 times the resources of, a Battaglino, as we were talking about earlier, someone who was in a very similar position a few years earlier, who was just sort of baffled by the whole process, was not able to identify the source, and then got banned for 4 years. Should they take that into account as in their discretion as judges? Probably. But for that to happen, it needs to actually go to the Court of Arbitration for Sport and not be settled. So there is that as well.
I do think that everyone, and especially the people who are against the decision that's happened and very much wanted Sinner to be banned for longer, I do feel like they're very black and white. This is a bit of a generalization, but they do see it very black and white, the law. And like you say, I prefer it to be, these judges are there for a reason. They exercise their judgment very, very well. And so I think I prefer that side of things. But maybe that's because we're sort of philosophicus. Yeah, that's quite tough. That says it all, really. I was going to say philosophizers.
Philosophizers. Yeah, something like that.
Anyway, might cut that out, might not, but
I really enjoyed that personally.
But yeah, I do just taking you back to something you said about Sinner having that explanation. There's something that was said on Andy Roddick's podcast that I thought was interesting. John Wertheim. He said, and I wrote this down because I wanted to get it right, that it seems that those with an alibi, so say, or an explanation for a banned substance being in their body, potentially are more likely. So those with an explanation are more likely to be viewed as okay. There's a reason for that. But those without an alibi and thinking when they've seen it in their body, they've got that email to say that they've had a bad substance in their body, they failed the drugs test, are more likely to be gobsmacked and being like, oh my goodness, what on earth? But those people without an alibi are viewed as are not actually treated with preferential treatment, whereas those with an alibi get that 48 hours and get that that time period out of the public eye. But it seems that those with an alibi are actually more like, if you actually have purposely doped, you'd be silly not to have some sort of explanation. Do you get what I'm trying to say there? And what are your thoughts on it? If you could try and just explain that much better than I just have?
No, I think that was pretty spot on. I think, you're saying the people with an explanation are seen as less guilty, and the people without one are seen as more guilty. But given the nature of what doping is, if you have an explanation, then that's quite suspicious, isn't it? Because doping, if you aren't guilty, is necessarily inadvertent. It happens without you knowing it, and that would suggest less guilty. If you don't know how this thing has got into your body, you're like, well, I don't know, and that's.
So should that be changed?
Guilty. It shouldn't, and the reason is sort of a legal one. It's this thing called strict liability. So basically, doping becomes impossible to enforce unless strict liability operates. And strict liability is basically in order for you to be liable for, not liable is not really the word in this for sport, but I'll use it anyway. In order to be liable for doping, you don't need to. It's sort of, you're liable regardless of fault. So you're liable regardless of your intention. All that needs to be proven is that in fact the substance was found in your body and that it was a banned performance enhancing substance. That is all that needs to be the case for you to be sort of guilty, for want of a better word, of doping. And then the onus of proof is on the player to prove otherwise. That is strict liability. This is why people confuse it with criminal law, is because that's exactly what happens in criminal law. There are some offences, like often parking offences. It's like, we don't care whether you intended to park in the wrong place or to speed. we caught you speeding. If there was a reason why, or if there was some sort of plausible explanation, then the onus of proof is on you as the speeder or you as the errant parker to prove otherwise. That is not how the rest of criminal law works. It's not like, you happen to, murder needs to be sort of proved with intent, and various other, most other crimes. But the intent in sport, it's too difficult for the onus to be on the regulatory body, on sort of the doping agency, to prove that all of these players intended to break the rules. They can't. How would that work? All of these players are going to say, "Oh God, that's how silly of me. I bought this thing over the counter without realizing. I'm sorry, but therefore you haven't proved intention, and therefore I get away with doping." It's impossible to enforce any doping without this rule of strict liability. So there are really good legal reasons why it is the way it is. I think if we are talking about reform now, if we're moving into that sort of area, I'm sort of going to manufacture my own question to myself, which is sort of something probably needs to change, and what should it be? I think the area that needs to, and I'd be interested to hear what you think as well, I think the area that needs to change probably is, what are these substances that we have banned, and at what level of blood milligrams per litre, or I can't think of the sort of unit, but what level are we saying is the threshold for this particular substance being performance enhancing? As we know, Sinner had a billionth of a gram of this stuff. We know that's not performance enhancing. We know probably a thousandth of a gram wouldn't be performance enhancing. That's probably the area that needs to be looked at, because I think that would get rid of a whole lot of these controversies if we just accepted probably that amount of that substance isn't going to change that much. The opposing view on that is that it's a slippery slope, and you have to have a marker somewhere. Having said, on the sort of the first side, I think the markers are just in the wrong place. We know that for much higher thresholds, this stuff just probably isn't performance enhancing, and we need to change that to stop these sort of controversies happening. Sorry, that was a very long response.
Yeah, that was one of the things that I think is massively in favour of the people that support Sinner, is the fact that it just wasn't performance enhancing.
Yeah,
and I know that shouldn't be the case, because essentially, if despite it not being performance enhancing, if he did mean to do it, that's still massively Sinner in the wrong, and then that wouldn't be good. But the fact that it wasn't performance enhancing is such a big thing for me anyway, it personally is. And also, just on that note of the levels of performance enhancing should be really monitored better, probably. It's interesting because when I looked up just yesterday, just doing some bit of research, tennis players that have been banned for doping, so many pop up that you don't realize there's actually a really, really long list. And some are long bans for dopers that probably have knowingly done it, but a lot actually are for contaminated food substances, or like, I don't know, they're on a night out and they've taken a bit of cocaine or something.
That was a really good one. I found that one fascinating.
Yeah.
I think you're talking, as well as, was that Chilich? Oh no, was the Italian? Was it another Italian? No, who was it?
It could have been another pair, but the one I was thinking of was Gasquet.
Sorry, Gasquet. Sorry, Gasquet is the one.
Yeah, because he it wasn't even, I don't think he was on a night out. I think he was just at a restaurant and he kissed his friend, as the French do, and that person had just taken cocaine, and so he got that contaminated with it. What do you know about that case?
Yeah, I found that one fascinating, because I was like,
that was a considerable ban as well, I think.
Talking of like stories of identifying the source of the substance, I'm like,
come on,
a believable story. I mean, like, I'm sure it might well be true. I mean, lots of people were convinced that it was true. I think that case went in his favour. I can't remember now, but I found that unbelievable. That was sort of like, obviously, he just kissed that girl who just did fine. It's like, no one's thought to think maybe Gasquet, who we know actually is a bit cheeky, We know. I don't. We know. I don't actually know Gasquet that well, obviously, but I'm pretty sure that he had some reputation for being a bit of a party boy. Is it not possible that he also just took some cocaine? I mean, I found it amazing that it was just so clear cut that we know the story. There were witnesses who were probably all his team or people who knew him. I don't know. I would have probably. I found that story quite incredible, really. That was his. That was the excuse he gave. That was the funniest of the cases I came across.
Yeah, it does seem a little bit crazy, and I just things like that where it's not performance enhancing. Yes, he's probably done something wrong, but it's not performance enhancing. So why are players being banned? And it's really damaging for the reputation of tennis as well, isn't it? Because the more and more that this stuff is happening, the players are looked upon in poor light, and people are less likely to get involved with the sport because they think, well, it's not fair, it's not just. So as much as people blame the system, it's actually very, very good at detecting any piece of substance. So it's actually, which way do you look at it?
And when you say it's very good, that's another really fascinating thing I learned about is they don't actually have to detect a particular substance sometimes in order to hand you a notice saying you've been doping. There's new systems now whereby, because they're testing all of these players all the time, they take their blood, they take their bloods obviously, and then they take their heart rate. They have a load of metrics on them every time that they test. And so apparently now, and maybe this is really commonplace and I'm sounding a little bit uninformed, but I was amazed at this. Apparently now they can basically say someone's been doping based on a sort of spike, a difference, a really sort of unexplained difference, say, in their heart rate on one particular occasion. If they've tested sort of the same heart rate over the last few months, and then suddenly there's a spike, or I'm using heart rate as that they have a bunch of different metrics, probably more complicated than that tell them, I imagine, with quite a high level of certainty that this person is obviously taking something, and they can use that as, we have the evidence that you're doping, even though there's no substance detected. I thought that was absolutely incredible. But I suspect the science is there, and the people that understand these things say we know that something's going on enough to be able to say that they're doping, which I thought was fascinating. So I think you're absolutely right. The methods they have for detecting this stuff are so good these days, almost too good.
It is crazy. Is there anything else that you think throughout this process, that what you've learned through writing your essay on it and just doing a bit of research and just knowledge about it, do you think there's anything else that needs to change, or is that the main thing? You think that these levels of performance enhancing really need to be checked and adjusted?
I think the thresholds that need to be found in your blood need to change. And I was going to sort of add to that point, because I think the consequence of that, if you make the thresholds higher, is that you start to get players who will sort of use that and say, right, well, if you are saying that the threshold is this, and there's a chance that there's a tiny bit of performance enhancement that I can get legally, then I've heard other commentators on this say, well, players will use that.
Yeah,
they will absolutely take that advantage. But I think the pro of that, of having that system where the thresholds are slightly higher, and maybe there is, if you take this substance at even that tiny bit, there is some sort of level of performance enhancement. If players take that opportunity and they do try and take that drug or whatever it happens to be, then the argument of the authorities can be, well, absolutely, you are welcome to take that risk. But then when they do exceed the threshold, then it's like, well, that's your own fault. You're accepting that risk, and this is the very common penalty that we all accept, and there's no controversy. I think that does get rid of controversy. And then it becomes, right, you're just transplanting the risk and the controversy from the governing bodies, who have to at the moment sort of work out, oh God, whose fault was it? Was it really that bad? You're putting that risk onto the players. And I think that's possibly quite a good answer to the problem. You're saying, okay, if you want to purposefully, intentionally take this stuff, go right ahead. But as soon as you go over that threshold, you're in the poo.
Serious mud, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting, and I think that sort of concludes that in where we think it might be able to go, and some potential solutions from your knowledgeable brain, Tim. I do just want to, like, some of the things that have come out as a result is one thing which I think is quite important to know, and I don't know if you've seen this, but so the PTPA, this sort of player-run body that are sort of helping players, to in various ways, whether that's money, whether that's other things. But the PTPA launched a pro bono legal program, ensuring players worldwide with equitable access to counsel and due process. I just wrote that down. I haven't just memorized that. But that's quite an interesting one. I do want to ask you, pro bono legal program, what on earth does that mean?
I'm really glad you've repeated yourself saying pro bono. I think generally it's pronounced pro bono.
Bono.
But I'm really glad you said that, because Bono's the singer.
Bono,
they may also,
I was going to say,
they may also be pro bono. I'm pro bono. A lot of people are pro bono. But
I don't know Bono personally, but I'm very pro. I'm pro his music.
So you're getting a giggle from Ben there as well, I think. Yeah.
Cheers. Well, if Ben's laughing, he's got a good sense of humour, so I reckon a lot of people listening will also be laughing.
It's all good content, all good content. But yeah, pro bono. Just checking, is this the Djokovic sort of sponsored? Because he was sort of setting
Professional
this up,
Tennis
right?
Players Association. Yeah. So this, just quickly, it is headed up by Djokovic, and remind me of his name. It is the Canadian player you saw at Wimbledon in the pub.
Pospisil.
Is Vasek Pospisil.
Yeah.
And those two, it's like Vasek Pospisil, I know, has a large amount to do with it. But actually this initiative was, I think they sort of say, co-founded by Tara Moore, who is another player who is undergoing still her battle with the law.
Yeah, I think it's a great thing. I think this is, as we've said, the Sinner case is really unusual, and I'm not sure my argument of sort of the unfairness of doping is actually all that well explained by the Sinner case, because, as we've said, actually there are reasons why actually it might not be the money and the sort of expensive lawyers that were the reason for his for the conclusion of that case. I do think there's an element of that, but as we said, I think it's not the whole story. Having said that, I do think there is probably a wider issue, and it sounds like this association is like doing a really good job of combating what inequality there is in tennis. I mean, that is something we do know, is that there's massive inequality. I think part of the research I did for my essay was this amazing research done by this guy, and his incredible graphs putting tennis next to like golf and these other sports that are also considered quite unequal, and tennis is the worst by far in terms of the income of the people in the top 10. We know that this is the case in tennis, and so like this sort of association is essential for those players who find themselves in absolute strife. Like, they've ultimately worked probably just as hard as the top players to get where they are. It's just that they're not earning the money, and their career could be ended by something like this in a heartbeat, where it's possible that, you know, a top player might escape it. So no, I think it's a really good thing. I can't say I know all that much about it, unfortunately, other than that I agree
it's
with
good.
it.
It's good. I think they get a bit of stick, those guys, for what they're doing, but that is definitely one thing that I think is very good. There's no harm in helping helping low ranked players try and become more equal. And just another brief thing, sort of slightly unrelated, but tennis, I think I saw something on Instagram where tennis is one of the lowest sports, is sort of one of the sports down the lowest place in terms of utilizing the money it gets from sponsors, ticketing and everything, and that money going towards the actual players' banks is so low. A lot of that money goes elsewhere, whereas other sports such as golf and other ones I can't quite remember, a lot of that money does go straight into the players' pockets.
Yes, I remember
which
reading
is quite
that.
interesting.
I remember reading that. I think that's the next thing. Tennis, to be fair to tennis, they are trying to combat this with the minimum wage, which I'm not sure if you've talked about on the podcast before, but that was another thing I found that was like, okay, some people are trying to do something really good here. I think the way that it works is there's sort of a threshold of earnings that if a player in the top 350 or 250, I can't remember what the rankings are, but if you don't make this amount of money in the tennis year, then the ATP or whatever governing body will top you up. The only thing I was thinking is that hopefully that does something to improve the inequality situation. Having said that, it is only for the top 250 players, so it is doing something. But hopefully it's not just widening the gap even further between sort of the top 250 and then the rest. And not like, I mean, there's only a limited amount of resources, and they got to start somewhere. And I think that's probably a fairly good start. So I was pleased to see that. Yeah, no, it's interesting. It'll be interesting. This week in Cardiff, there is the Progress Tour, which and probably a fair few people listening will know. It's a prize money tournament, but it sort of accommodates for low ranked players from sort of anything from probably 600 ATP. There's a few higher ranked players that play towards ITF ranked players and even unranked players, and there's a decent amount of prize money, and you get matches every day, and it's very good for that sort of thing. So I'm going to go in and sort of interview a few players, and it'll be interesting to hear how they're getting on. A few I know personally, a few I don't, but it's fascinating. One is James Story, who's the Welsh number one. So the number one tennis player in Wales. I think he's ranked around 750, and that's something I'm going to ask him, is just how difficult is it trying to fund yourself, because his job is tennis now. He's someone I played growing up, and he's relying on himself. Wow. That's incredible. It's incredible. So, for people like him, if he, for example, has all of a sudden got a contaminated substance in his body, he'd be screwed, because how you don't have the legal team of Sinner to be able to do that. So it is interesting, and I think fundamentally, like we said, it is unfair. But I think to an extent it's unamendable, but there are certain things that we can do to bridge the gap a little bit. Yeah, definitely. And I think something like that PTPA is going to help. I was just thinking about James Story, who you mentioned. I'm actually not sure what doping sort of rules apply at that level, and at the sort of Progress Tour level. I'm sure there are some. I'm not sure if do they get tested at the Progress Tour? They don't at the Progress Tour, no. I know it is part of the UTR Pro Tennis Tour, some event, so I think that would probably have a system in place. But I'm not sure. But I know the ITF does. It's the same for the ITF as to the ATP Tour, because it's all under the ITIA. So that would be, like challenges, events and stuff, that would all be tested, would it? Yeah, definitely, yeah. Because, those guys, if they're funding it themselves, they're going, they're staying in hotels, they're not, I don't know, I just can't imagine. The work you'd have to go into tracking exactly what you eat and make it, and sort of tracking what substances are banned, that changes year on year. The massive list I have listeners can go onto the WADA code and look at the substances that are banned. You can't understand any of them because they're all like 16 syllables long, and God knows where they exist. God knows what stuff over the counter contain them. You can't, that's just the supplement stuff. There's a lot of guidance from them on like what supplements you can take, or just like caution you should take when taking supplements. But loads of tennis players will take loads of supplements and lots of stuff to help their performance. How like their schedules must be rammed. They're playing tournaments, but they're training. Like who's doing this for them? Most of these people don't employ a team to manage this stuff. So sure enough, difficult. Down the line they're going to get caught out, and I don't know. It's probably organisations like the PTPA that will back them up if and when that happens. It's very tough, that's for sure. Cool. Well, I think that's sort of, in terms of Sinner, that's I think we've talked about a fair bit there, and as much as we're not trying to reinvent the wheel, I think it was quite nice just to chat a bit about it more generally from a fan's perspective from my side, but also we had that in-depth sort of conversations with your knowledge of what you've been studying and what you're going to go into. So that was really good, and hopefully the people listening could take bits and pieces from it, and some
some they probably won't agree with, but yeah, just interesting to have a chat about it, and yeah, good to get a slightly different topic on the podcast. The last thing I want to ask you is, you seem like you said at the start that you're heading, you feel like commercial law is where you want to be headed. What do you think? Is there any part of you that wants to go into sports law?
Absolutely, yeah, I'd love to. I think, yeah, I was looking at Jamie Singer's profile and like the team around him at, I can't remember the name of the firm now, but it just looks awesome.
Onside Law?
Onside Law, yeah. It's obviously like they're just a specialist sports law team, and I suspect they do a lot of doping work. That looks so exciting. And to be honest, I'm heading into like dispute resolution, which is basically what these guys do. They're solving doping disputes, which is what this is. So I think a lot of those guys will I think that guy James Singer worked for Clifford Chance, which is like one of the biggest law firms in the world. It's headquartered in London, and he would have had decades of experience there doing commercial, probably dispute resolution. I haven't actually checked his LinkedIn, but I think that's probably what he would have done, and then he will have segued into something a bit more niche, which is sports law. So who knows? Who knows whether in decades to come I might be able to do that sort of thing. I would love to, but there's a journey to it. Unfortunately, you can't finish your law degree and jump straight into defending Sinner's doping case. I would love if that was the case, but it's not. So it's a bit of a journey to there, but I would love to do it.
Yeah. Very good. Well, good luck with all the continued studies. Not long to go now. So, yeah, all the best.
Oh, thanks, Alex. I really enjoyed that.
My final question, it can be a short one. Don't worry. But everyone that comes on the podcast suggests a future guest. I think it's quite a nice way to keep on spreading the word of the podcast. So, any ideas? Any like ones that are possible to, ideally?
Gosh, interesting. I actually
any Australian guests, or always welcome.
It would be good to suggest an Australian one, but I can't think of one. But I am going to suggest someone. I think it's someone who I've mentioned to you before, but only very briefly, and it's sort of through a friend of mine here, Elise. She said I got into a conversation with her recently, and she was saying that a close family friend of theirs is one of the two head coaches at Wimbledon. And I think he would be a really interesting person to get on. Unfortunately, embarrassingly, I cannot remember his name, but we have had this conversation, haven't we?
We have. He's the master of ceremonies at Wimbledon too. So
that's the one.
He's in charge of all that side of things, which I think would be an interesting side.
That's right. Yeah, and you're probably thinking that would be a good one. If you could just please send me, the contact details that you promised you'd send me, then maybe I will.
Actually, yeah, that is true. You did say you'd do that, so I'll be waiting.
That's a good reminder for me, but I think that's my suggestion.
Thank you very much. Sounds good. We'll get in contact with him, and hopefully he'd be happy to come on.
Apparently so.
All right. Thank you very much, Tim, and all the best.
Thanks, Alex. See you soon.
Well, there we have it. Another episode ticked off, and it's a really important one to be able to chat about openly and to see where tennis is going to take their doping process in years to come. So thanks very much, Tim, for coming on. It was pretty cool to have a family member on the Tennis Uncovered podcast, so hopefully we can have some more in the future, but lots more content to be released in the coming weeks. And yeah, thanks so much for listening, and see you next time.